Hello YouTube, I'm Toby. Now this right here is a GTX 260 and I was honestly curious about whether or not this thing could play a Fortnite. Now this particular GTX 260 is a blower style design. It's made by ASUS. It's got two DVI ports and it uses two 6-pin power connectors. Now the system we'll be putting this in is, just one that I've recently built. It's got an Athlon quad-core processor 845. Got 8 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. So without further ado, let's get into some benchmarking. Now first off, I wanted to try out the Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and I set the settings to medium and fired up the game. Now this particular map is Militia, and we seem to be running around 60 frames per second. There were some higher frame rates, a few lower frame rates, and a little bit of stuttering, but ultimately I think this was quite playable on this system. Now I had MSI Afterburner running in the background, and I'll show you the graph for the CPU and GPU utilization. I really can't remember the result, but here they are. Now next up, I decided to run Fortnite. I set the settings to low, and keep in mind I had fraps running in the background. And the game told me this might cause some issues, and I can already tell it caused some issues with the MSI Afterburner since I could not see the GPU CPU utilization graph, so we don't have the data from that. But generally the game seemed to run around 20 frames per second, which with a lot of stuttering, so that was not a good experience. I later tried to run the game without fraps running in the background, and this really didn't seem to do much of a difference. Now the real reason why I tried to run without fraps in the background was to get the data from MSI Afterburner, but once again that was not running properly. Now the last benchmark we'll be running today is Resident Evil 6 benchmarking tool. I set these settings to medium, and the score we got was 3,579 points, and as the game says, it works at a standard level, and that's pretty much what I expected from the GTX 260. Now I also have the CPU and GPU utilization graph from Resident Evil, and we can clearly see that the GTX 260 is bottlenecking the Athlon 845 quite a bit. Alright, now after the initial testing of the GTX 260, I decided to see if I couldn't improve the score a little bit. Now I decided to use MSI Afterburner to overclock both the GPU core and the memory. And I did get a nice little overclock, I believe somewhere around 125 megahertz on the core, and a little over 250 on the memory. This actually took a while to get right, but when I fired up Resident Evil 6 benchmarking tool, I got over 4,000 points. So it's fair to say we're seeing a quite big improvement to the GTX 260. The next test I decided to run, I actually decided to run Fortnite again. I used the same settings, and truth be told, it actually ran quite well. It was only running somewhere around 30 or 40 frames per second, but it's a significant improvement to the the 20 to 30-ish FPS from before. But unfortunately this story doesn't have a happy ending, since Fortnite crashed shortly after. I have had some stability issues running this overclock, and I may have pushed the card a little too hard, but I wanted to get as much out of it as I possibly could. Even though I'm having stability issues and Fortnite crashed, I decided to fire up Counter-Strike Global Offensive running at medium settings. For some reason Counter-Strike Global Offensive seemed to run worse than it did before, and it was honestly unplayable at this point. I think this has something to do with the overclock I applied to the GTX 260. I don't think the card is stable enough, and I've seen this in some of my other tests when I overclock the system, that for some reason it seems that if I push it too hard, the core underclocks significantly, and it loses a lot of performance points, and I think this may have been what happened during the final seconds of the Fortnite test, and now in Counter-Strike Global Offensive. I don't have much MSI data on this, since during the Fortnite test MSI crashed as well as the Unreal Engine. but I do have a little bit from the CSGO tests, and as you can see, the GPU is bottlenecking the CPU quite a bit. Now I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you very much for watching.